How's it going, my friend? You doing all right?
I am doing just fine. How are you, Steve?
Sweet, sweet, doing great. Welcome in, everyone, to another episode of the Story World podcast. This is, believe it or not, episode number 9. Like, this is crazy. I know this was like a random idea we had, and here we are.
Still haven't run out of topics.
Yeah, no, still haven't. Actually, we're recording 2 episodes tonight, and both of these are ones that were sort of from Alex's list of topics and ideas. So I was telling him earlier, these are not topics that I would have picked, but that's why this is so great, right? I think it's gonna be really cool to kinda step out of my comfort zone a little bit and answer some of these questions. So I'm pumped about it.
Yeah, definitely. It is funny because the first, I guess, 8 or 9 episodes that we've done have been kind of topics that you listed first, and that we decided to go with. Then I was looking down my list, and just the couple that we're going to be doing next, I think should provide a really good stepping stone for conversation, and maybe get into a little bit more serious topics and just kind of see where it takes us. So I'll
Yeah.
go ahead and lead us into this first one. So.
Yeah,
uh,
please do.
Introducing children to stories. Um, I think that yeah, I'll just lead off kind of with the first thoughts that I have about it. I'm kind of looking at this from a more serious angle, I suppose,
Mhm.
rather than just giving your kids, fun stories and spending time with them. That's part of it. But I think that, well, I'll just read what I kind of have put. One of the things that I always hated growing up, and I'm sure I will use it on my daughter at some point, but I'm really going to try to stay away from saying it, is telling your children because I said so.
Mhm.
Maybe there's a time and place for that. I haven't really gotten
Yeah.
to the point in parenting where I've had to say that, so I could be proved wrong. But at the very least, in a legitimate circumstance, when your child is really wondering why you have said something or why something has to be this way,
Mhm.
I think because I said so is probably one of the worst responses that a parent can give their kid. Um, I didn't hear it too much growing up, hardly at all, but just every once in a while I would hear it, and you see it in other families too. And that's kind of that. But saying something like that can really affect a child from whether they ask questions in the future or challenging their thought process and just having a conversation with them. I know it's not necessarily story related, but just to kind of point out how children are affected by even such a small statement like that, or a small, rejection like that, can really have an effect on child in the long term. Another thing too, kind of on the silly side, but I think every kid has heard this growing up. I would be sitting on the floor. I know that people are listening, not watching video, can't see me, but I have my hands pushed up against my cheek, and I'm, playing around in my face and just kind of sitting there being lazy. And I remember always being told, don't touch your face like that, or don't scratch up your face like that, or else it'll stay that way. And I remember as a 4, 5, 6 year old, dang, that terrified me. So I would be by myself sometimes, leaning on my hand, and my cheek would be up, covering my eyeball, and I would be scared to death and immediately stop because I think, oh my goodness, yeah, my face is gonna be at that, and it would terrify me. And then it probably took me longer than I probably cared to admit to realize that that was a lie, maybe until I was 8, 9 years old or so. But that's a silly thing. It didn't harm me long term, knowing that it's a kind of a foolish thing. But at the same time, man, kids just take in whatever you give them. And there's no telling where their thought process might go with something, or how they're able to handle one thing versus another. So that's kind of where I'm viewing this topic from, is that kids just, they love to learn, they love to listen, and they take in everything you say. And so that's kind of more the serious tone that I was referring to, of kind of where I want it to go.
Yeah. No, I like that because, I mean, so I have 4 children. Alex has 1, and
Amen.
and
Amen.
I am winning that battle, that is for sure, or Alex is. And no, but it is true. Kids are super, impressionable, and I always kinda joke that, like, a lot of times my kids like to take things super literally, and, well, it's because they're kids, they're just learning how to navigate the world. They literally don't have the brain development, like, it's not to that point yet where they can make these conceptual differences. In fact, a lot of this stuff, there's plenty of evidence that shows it doesn't even come in until they're, a young adult. I mean,
Yeah.
teenagers don't have a developed enough brain to be able to make some of these distinctions and separate these categories out. And so you really do have to be careful with some of the things you say. And I actually really love that this whole idea of because I said so. This is what I do. I struggle with, and I agree with you in everything you said. And that's what my struggle is that I agree with you, and yet sometimes I find myself saying this. And what's
And
interesting is,
I do want
but
to, sorry to interrupt you. I do want to put a disclaimer here. I'm very passionate about kind of the subject and focusing on just doing the best you can for your kid. But with that, I mess up all the time. I think you and I had a conversation where every day I just feel like I messed up
yeah.
as a dad again. And so I just want to put that disclaimer in there. Sorry.
Totally. No, no, that's cool. I think it's really weird, right? I think in some sense, a lot of us are doing better than we're giving ourselves credit for. And it's just it's well, it's kind of like um this is a little bit of a tangent, but it is a story. There was I want to really be careful with what I say and how I say it here, but a few years ago at the church that we attended prior to this one, there was a revival that had broken out. Now, if you're not from the Christian, like, background, okay, this is a Southern tent meeting, so underneath a big tent, gospel revival thing that happened, and what it basically looks like is, at least in this context, what it looked like is it started out as a teen camp, and it was a week of teen camp, and it was a great time. It was like at the evening services during that week, it would be like not just for teens, it would be for anybody in the church who wanted to come along. And on the Friday night of the first week of that teen camp, it just broke out. It was like it was a really powerful move of God that was happening. And the church went into well, not just a church, it was actually a youth fellowship that was made up of our church and some surrounding churches. And so what happened is they decided to extend the revival out, and it ended up going for, I think, a little over a month. I want to say it was either a month or it went up to like 6 weeks. That sounds kind
Wow.
of familiar. This was back in 2017, so it's
Wow.
been a few years ago now. It's hard to believe. Now, yeah, this is where I really do want to be careful. Uh, and one of the issues that is at least possible to have in a scenario like that, when there seems to be this genuine move of God, something real that's happening in the lives of people, um, it acts kinda like drugs, okay? Now, I know that sounds weird. But you've heard, surely, people talk about how the reason why drug addicts become addicted is because the first time they experience it, they get this high, and every time after that, it's they're trying to experience that first time feeling again, and they never can quite get there. Well, there's a real danger in this sort of thing happening. That's a little bit of a tangent, though. So where I wanted to go with that is this. So inside of this um, context of the revival, there was there were some people who were so sort of swept up in the moment that they began to question whether or not they were even saved. Like they really didn't like they were thinking, "Oh my gosh, I'm not feeling whatever specific feeling," or "I'm not, like I'm not having the same reaction to this as so and so is having," or whatever. And so they would begin to um question their salvation and whether or not they really even knew God, God really knew them or whatever. And so I remember our pastor um, having to have a specific, actually, he spent a couple messages on the fact that if you are someone who is even um, thinking about and questioning this whole idea, and it was I'm getting somewhere, I promise. It was very, very helpful what he said, because all these people were doubting their salvation and everything, and what he said was that, "Look, if you're in this place where you're concerned about honoring God, you're concerned that you are living a life of sin, right? Right? You're concerned that you're going to offend God or whatever, that you're not actually saved. He said that's actually the best evidence that you are,
Hmm.
right? And so it's because you are concerned about it that you are um that you have assurance of it in a sense. Okay. It's like if you weren't worried about it and you were turning and you were rejecting, then you would have a problem. Why did I tell you that? Well, because it reminds me of exactly what we're talking about with being a good parent or a bad parent. And since we are going down a more serious pathway with this, I do think that's important to mention that, like, as parents, I'm telling you, I promise. I mean, I can't speak for you guys, and you've already made the same point, but me and my wife wake up every day and go to bed every day feeling like we've totally failed. But it's within our awareness of that, that I take comfort in knowing that we're doing a good job. And when we talk to other people, or that at least that we're doing the best that we can. And when we talk to other people and describe a lot of what we're going through, a lot of times they describe those same scenarios to us, even though when you see their kids in church or in the restaurant or whatever, they look like they're totally well behaved and they're totally doing what they're told and everything like that. Um, it perception is not always, well, it's not usually the actual reality of the case. And so I do think it's important that as we seek to parent our children. I know there's lots of context that you can introduce children to stories, but I think as parents, that's definitely going to be one of the biggest ones that we'll discuss. Um, it's important to realize that you're probably doing the best you can, and you should probably give yourself some grace. So, do I tell my kids you should do this because I said so? Heck yes. I tell them that from time to time. I say, I'm your dad and I said do this. And I always feel in those moments like I have done them a disservice. At the same time, a legitimate question that I would have is like, well, what well, two things. Number one, is there a philosophical point to be made of I don't have to explain myself to you. I'm an authority. You should learn that. Like, and so that's a question I would have. Like, where does that come in? And then the second piece of that would be like, just genuinely, how do you like some things you just can't explain to a
I know.
4 or 5 year
Yeah.
old?
No,
Yeah,
absolutely. That's why I'm saying I can definitely see scenarios where either one, the child is too young to understand the concept, or you don't want to have the discussion yet. So I um,
yeah,
definitely see that. And even though this is a podcast about stories, it's also so that we can discover how stories relate to our lives,
that's right.
and that we can make good decisions and just learn from all these discussions. So kind of echoing what you said, um, and I know that Steve and I, you and I hang out quite often. Our wives hang out quite often. We see each other's families a lot. Where we visit each other quite often, and so we get to see the mess that's in both of our lives. But there are some parents out there that might not have that support group or see other parents parenting, and might actually legitimately feel that um, they go to bed at night really thinking that they are a bad parent. And that might not necessarily be the case. Like what you said, a good indication that you're a good parent is probably when you feel like there's a lot more that you could be doing to help your child. So just to kind of provide some encouragement out there to anyone who may be listening who sometimes feels that way. It's funny that I'm looking through your notes here, and what Steve and I do is we kind of put down our notes in different ways, and we don't really talk about what we're going to do beforehand. But looking at Steve's notes, uh, our kind of what we wanted to talk about line up together. So I'm just going to go ahead through my points, and I think you'll probably just be able to jump in with whatever your thoughts are. I think
That's
that'll
great,
be
man. Yeah, let's do it.
so. Uh, while this isn't a Christian podcast, Steve and I obviously are Christians, and so that topic will come up from time to time. And this is one of the first points that I have. So feel free to listen. It might still be applicable to you, or skip ahead if you want. There's will be other stuff for you, I'm sure. But one of the things that I want to talk about first is telling stories from the Bible to your children, or just teaching them about the Bible and just, Christianity and what Jesus taught and who Jesus is and salvation. I think that so one of the things that I remember as a kid, is singing the song Zacchaeus was a wee little man. Did you ever
And a
see
wee little man was
that?
he.
Wee little man was he,
That's right. He climbed up
and
in a sycamore tree.
climbed up in the
Lord,
sycamore
have
tree.
mercy.
And
Yeah.
and in me saying this, I am not saying that singing those songs is wrong or that it's not good for kids. Obviously, like I had fun singing it and I'm laughing about it now, and it's obviously brought me some sort of memories. But at
Yeah.
the same time, I feel like sometimes teaching kids, whether it's in Sunday school or in the home, we can very much make it seem like the stories in the Bible are silly or
Right.
that they're like the cartoons that they watch on TV.
Yeah.
And so again, obviously, have a coloring book with Bible stories in it, sing those funny songs. But
Yeah.
at the same time, yeah, obviously, as a Christian, you want to teach your children that these are real stories that happen and really communicate with them. Obviously, there's certain ages that, kids for understanding and each kid will be different. But I kind of have here, just as a suggestion, you can kind of add on to this and probably have your own thoughts. But I think, especially when your kid gets to a certain point, kids understand stuff at such a young age, whether it's 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, just sit down and read a story from the Bible with them or
Yeah.
or tell them to them. You don't have to necessarily go verse by verse. If you know a story in the Bible, whether it's about Jesus healing a leper or any of the miracles that he performed or teaching about love or whatever story you want, just sit down and tell your kids about it, whether it's at dinner time and say, "Hey, I got a story from you." I'm sure at this point they'll probably, have been to church and know who Jesus is, and just tell them and ask them what they think about the story. Make it a real thing, not just something they sing about in church on Sundays.
Yeah. That's a fantastic point on multiple counts. So two things, like we see this a lot. So one of my alter ego, well, not alter ego, but I am affectionately referred to as the Bible nerd pretty much wherever I go. And I shameless plug for the Bible Nerd podcast. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about is like creation, because that's where a lot of times school, like if a kid is going to start doubting the Bible in school, a lot of times it's going to be in science class. But just because, not to get too deep down this rabbit hole, but just because there are some real differences between what a face value reading of the scriptures seems to say about Earth and
Mhm.
the history of life versus what you would learn in a typical mainstream science textbook or class or whatever. And so I'm really fascinated in the science of that. So there's actually people who are, conservative evangelical Christians who hold to a historical grammatical hermeneutic of the Bible, who actually are, credentialed scientists as well. And so hold, that what they try to do is understand the world from within a biblical framework and not within a conventional framework. And these people are, again, they're just as qualified and credentialed as anybody else to be studying in their fields and to have these opinions. And one of the fascinating things when you do creation work, when you do research in that area, is you have to pay attention to the flood. And the reason is because if the biblical flood happened, which there's a whole probably episode that we could have, which would actually be kind of fun, I think, on flood legends, because it's
That
actually,
that would be fun.
I
That would
think,
be great.
very story. Like you'd be surprised. Like, I mean, again, for the non-Christian listener, like it would probably feel like an episode of Joe Rogan or something talking about something
Yes.
just wild. But to really distill that down like into one sentence is I believe that the biblical account is the true account of the flood, and that all these others are basically mythical retellings. And I have evidence for that. I'm not just asserting that, right? And so what's interesting though is that if you look at like one of the most common and popular depictions of a biblical story for children is the ark. That sort of
Yes.
this tiny little scrunched up like Volkswagen almost with these oversized,
Sticking out the giraffe
like,
smile.
yeah, the giraffes and the elephants
Yes.
sticking out of it. And
Having a
there's
good old
actually,
time, Steve.
I'm telling you, it's an actual problem. And
Yeah.
people are like, "Oh, come on, Steve." No, like it's an actual problem because it gives credence to what I think is a lie. that this story is make believe, that this is not true, that this is just some story. Now I know we're just trying to make it look good, like look like something compelling to kids. Okay, fine, but like not at the expense of their believing its truth value one day,
Mhm.
right? And so like
Exactly.
if you look at like even studies have been done to show that the biblical description of an ark is of the ark of Noah is was actually possible and actually very plausible that it could actually flow and all these things. So again, without getting too far down into that, like there's a helpful way, even if it doesn't look exactly like what the real thing did look like. You know, we weren't there, so we don't know. But there's a helpful way and an unhelpful way to depict those kind of things. Going along with that, one of my favorite authors who we're going to talk about in our next episode, where we talk about some of our favorite storytellers. His name is Greg Kokel, and he's a great writer. And he makes the case um, that when we talk about Bible stories, ironically, he thinks that we might should even ditch the word stories when referring to them that way, because the word can be compromised to talking about mostly fiction. So it's almost like when you hear the word story, like a lot of people tend to think towards fiction. And that's at least how a lot of like professional, like atheists and skeptics and really vocal people will talk about the Bible. Oh, it's just a collection of silly children's stories. And so for that reason, he actually likes to refer to to biblical stories as accounts, so accounts of history. So there are stories, for example, Jesus telling a parable, his parables are pretty much fictional stories. So like used in a sentence, you could tell someone about the account of Jesus telling the story or the parable of the sower, right?
I've never really thought about that before, but that's a very honestly, just even aside from the connotations of what it can mean, but that's just a very simplistic way of separating, and categorizing things in the Bible, whether a parable is obviously a story, but Jesus doing this is an account of his life. So that's actually very helpful.
Yeah, I think so too, and I don't this is actually one of my questions that I have in my list. Well, not really. What I my list of things to talk about for the show are a mix, right, really of questions
Yeah,
and thoughts, but
absolutely.
it's like, how do we communicate that difference? And again, this is not just about I mean, let's take Christianity out of the picture for a minute for the sake of argument. I mean, it's like when you talk about your family history or you talk about something that happened, like, how do you make that distinction, right? Between because a lot of times as parents, you know, we can go to the obvious one, you know, SANTA. But like a lot of times we do treat fictional things as real with our kids for a certain period of time. And so it's really important that we learn how to make that distinction. And I'm not going to pretend like I have that all figured out, but it is something that is worth discussing. So.
Yeah. No, I think those are excellent points. It's funny that you brought up Santa because that is definitely one of my talking points that
Cool.
we will dig into. And I feel like that there's going to be an uproar on both sides of this. I
Probably.
don't, um, but yeah, and again, obviously, there's a difference between my daughter's 3 and your oldest, not almost 3, and your oldest son is 6, right? He's 6 now. So
That's
there's
right, yeah.
obviously a difference between how to tell a story or an account from the Bible, depending on the age of your kid, of course.
100%.
But kids, man, I remember 9 years old knowing so much stuff from the Silmarillion and being able to understand a lot of the history of Middle Earth. You don't, your child does not have to be very old to understand a
Yeah,
lot of things. Um, just something to think about.
yeah. No, I agree. And I always right? It's difficult for me to know, like, sometimes she surprised like, talking about Riker, my six-year-old, like, sometimes he surprises me with how much he knows, and, like, his memory is so
Mm,
good that he can remember things that even I can't remember. I mean, he's a really good learner, and
mm,
so, yeah, it's kinda hard to find that line between, like, well, when do you go ahead and dive in and try to give like, I remember again, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but these it's just bringing things to mind of, like, I remember when I was a new parent, I was reading a lot of parenting books, and I was looking for all the advice I could, and the irony is, like, I remember when my when Riker was, like, 2, like, trying to be really intentional about giving explanations for things because I didn't just want to be the hey do this parent. I wanted to be the why parent. And I think like I don't know, it's almost like maybe we're having an intervention here. I almost burned myself out on doing that because he didn't understand. Whereas like now, I probably need to return to that because they would understand. But now it's almost like I've lost my patience. I've got, I'm trying to explain to one while three others are yelling, screaming,
Parenting.
literally screaming things in my ear, right? And so yeah, trying just to find that balance and figure out how to give each kid the attention they need and tell them stories differently and interact with them differently. I mean, this is, yeah, a lot about parenting here that we're talking about, but these are all really important things that I think about every single day.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, because Steve's and I goal in this podcast isn't just to tell interesting stories or tell stories that we like. It's about asking these questions of whether, again, not even whether you are Christian or not. When do you introduce your kid to different levels of storytelling, and what stories do you tell them at what maturity level? And so it really, Steve and I obviously don't have half the answers. This is more of a thought process of thinking through it and just trying to kind of see what maybe best to handle situations with your child in these ways. So a lot of
Yeah.
good thoughts there. Do you want to the rest of my discussion, I believe, is kind of more geared towards fictional side of things. Do you have any more thoughts on the um Christian side of teaching your kids about the Bible and or real
Um, well, I guess I have a couple other thoughts that we can throw in if we're
Yeah,
gonna
absolutely.
if we're gonna just hang out on that for just a
Yeah,
minute.
let's do it. We're right here.
And then we can move over to fiction. So, um, again, I don't know really the best way to go through these. So one of the things I think is interesting is research actually shows that that the story of God, um, makes sense to children even from birth. Meaning that you there seems to be like when you get now I'm big into what's called Christian apologetics. And so for the uninitiated, what this means is basically giving a defense, a rational defense, for the Christian faith. And so a lot of people anyway, that's the point, right? Is yeah, these are not just stories. We think they're true. And if they are true, there's going to be actual evidence for them. Um, and when you're dealing with a lot of like atheists and skeptics and a lot of deconverts, actually, people who used to be Christians or at least used to claim Christianity and then now they no longer do. Um, a lot of times you get this this funny uh um almost default mode of thinking that children should be atheists by default, right? So you get people saying stuff like, "Oh, you shouldn't teach your kids what to believe. You shouldn't force your Christianity on them." Or some of the diehards will even be like, "Oh, you shouldn't necessarily force your atheism on them, or you shouldn't force any religion on them." And it's almost like there's this assumption of a default skepticism that children grow up with. So they're atheists by default, Christian or God believing, forgetting about even Christianity, like theistic, like God believing, um, by training or by upbringing, but they're atheists by default. That's actually not true. It's actually like the furthest thing from truth that there is. Like there have been plenty of documented studies showing that the kids are like the language they use is literally wired to believe in God, like wired to believe in the supernatural, wired to believe in the spiritual. It's only as they become like westernized, scientistic, you know, Americans and Europeans that they start to go into this atheistic, skepticism mode. Like in the East, the question is not, is there a God? Nobody asks that question. The question in the East is, what is the nature of God? Who is God? What is God like? It's a default assumption of theism. And we all migrated here. Like we all come from the East, right? And so like we think that in some sense we've moved beyond this, but we really haven't. And so I think sometimes we are influenced in our culture that we shouldn't be telling our kids about God or like that like our like, then it's wrong. And I'll admit, I've even fallen, even though I'm so far and deep into this, I've fallen into that trap before. Like, oh, am I just like forcing my religion on my kids or whatever? And the reality is that that's just not true. Your kids are wired to believe in God. You're actually you're taking something away from them if you are trying to make them become default skeptics, because that's just not actually how the world works. At least that's not what the best science we have seems to say. Um, and then
It's
yeah,
well,
go ahead.
as far as the wonder part of it and how kids are wired towards that,
Uh,
an argument could be made that, um, tell a kid any story and they'll imagine it and they'll believe it and they'll play pretend with it and everything. But
mhm.
the difference, and of course, this is such a simple saying, and we're not, you and I could go on for hours and hours for on apologetic side of arguments and things, but just from a simple statement that I heard that is very interesting is adults don't children don't stop believing in Santa, and then when they get older, go back to believing in Santa. They don't grow up
That's right.
thinking that Lord of the Rings is true and then not, and then coming back to it and realizing, oh, the Lord of the Rings is a true location. But by the millions, people still believe. Again, even taking Christianity, that just theistically, they either continue to believe in God or a God, or they come back to it. It's something that is
Yeah.
in us. Anyway,
Yeah. No, that's really good. So I think that sort of buttons that up. There is one more thing I want to mention, and this maybe just dives into a little bit of the fun real quick, and then we
yeah.
can get serious again, and then back to fiction. Um, but the Mandela effect. Okay,
Mhm.
so it's like one of the most should we explain that? Let's explain that. So the Mandela effect, you know what I'm talking about, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, yeah. So the Mandela effect is, and you can maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, but it started with this idea that so Nelson Mandela is this what like this African leader guy, and I think the whole like he was part of the whole apartheid thing. I'm not going to pretend to know my history well, um, but I think right the whole isn't the whole thing like originated from this widespread belief that he died in prison or something like that. But
Yes, the
then
90s.
in the 90s, right? Like he died in prison in the
Yes.
90s. Like everybody thought that,
You
but
ask people what happened to Nelson Mandela. Oh, he died.
yeah,
Yep.
exactly. It's like this widespread cultural phenomenon belief that just isn't true. It just isn't true. Um, it is, I mean, I think he's still alive today, isn't he? Is he still alive
I
today,
think
or
I
has he
think
since
he is.
died?
If he's passed away, you go ahead and keep talking. I'm gonna look it up. Maybe he passed away recently. But he's still
He
alive.
did. He actually okay, he did. He passed away in 2013.
Oh, what's
So he did. So he did yeah, he did pass away in 2013. But yeah, like the whole thing is that people thought he died in prison like in the 90s.
it's
And
just
that
it's
it
just
just
something.
didn't
It's an
happen.
untruth. It's just something that is just not.
Right.
And the
Exactly.
reason why I say it's an untruth is because I know this isn't about telling kids story, but Steve and I got here, and so this is where we're at. It's
Yeah.
the reason why I say it's an untruth is because I don't think it's even a lie. I don't think someone spread a lie. It's just something
Mhm.
that people think happened.
Yeah, exactly right. No, you're exactly right. And but what's interesting is the reason I brought this up is because it actually applies both to the Bible and to children in the sense that there are things that are not in the Bible that people think are in the
Mm.
Bible. Now there's this can be a little bit more abstract or a little bit more I guess practical. So like one of the more abstract things is and this I'm going to tell on my wife just a little bit.
Uh,
And she's a preacher's kid, so she should know better. But like so just the other day, we were talking about how you ever heard the phrase God helps those who helps themselves,
yeah.
right? And like she was we were talking about something and and it was like yeah, that's in the Bible somewhere. Like I forget exactly where it says it,
Yeah.
but it's not. Like that's not like what is in the Bible is something I'm paraphrasing epically here, but if you don't work, you don't eat. That is
Yeah.
right, that comes from the Bible. But there are a and this is and this one that one that I mentioned is just one of like 5 or 6 probably that we could name off that are
Probably
like that.
right next to the verse that girls have to wear culottes below their knees. It's
Yeah.
that one. And
Yes. Yes, it's right next to the culottes verse, 100%. First Hesitations, 87, yeah.
yes.
Um, no, for sure, right? So that's one. Another really common one is, let me maybe I'll trip you up, okay?
Oh no.
Yeah, this
Don't
is a
don't do
this
this
is
to
a
me.
trick question. Are you ready for this? In the
I've not, but give it
okay,
to me, Bible
okay.
scholar.
In the end times, in the book of Isaiah,
Okay.
the blank will lie down with the lamb. What is it?
Well, I'm gonna say lion.
Exactly, and you're gonna be wrong.
Yeah,
That's not what the Bible says. The Bible
that's
says that it's the wolf that will lie down with the lamb,
interesting.
not the lion, right? And
Wow.
right, exactly. And there's
That
other things.
that one has blown me more than
Mhm.
any other of the Mandela tests that I've seen. That's
Yep,
a
yep.
wow.
Yep, and if you I mean, you could probably just Google, oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, there's whole
So many of them.
huge things about this, with the Mandela effect and the Bible. There's another one. Oh, here's a couple. I'm just gonna name off a few real quick.
Yeah.
Eve gave Adam an apple. That's not in the Bible. It was a fruit, right? Not an apple
Right.
necessarily, right? 3 wise men visited Jesus at the stable. That's in all of your Christmas songs, but it didn't happen. They visited Jesus when he was like 2.
Yeah.
That angels sing and play harps, etc. So like there's a lot of these things that people, yeah, there's one, there it is. God helps those who helps themselves. Um, um, yeah, so spare the rod, spoil the child, right? Oh, you know what? I think that's it. No, I think that's the one we were talking about the other night.
Mhm.
Anyway, regardless, right? So spare the rod, spoil. So the point is, and it's not any kind of indictment against her, because it's just the fact that, like, a lot of people think this,
Yeah.
and so, like, I don't know necessarily what we're gonna get in terms of teaching value out of this, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying that, like, it's really interesting that you can grow up and you can have this book of true things, and just your cultural context, the way you grow up, the people that you grow up around, can actually, like, change your experience and your perception of what the real thing actually is. And so I guess I don't know. I mean, maybe what I don't know what the lesson here is. Maybe that underscores just the importance of making sure that you're regularly in the word, so you know what it does and does not say, and that you're regularly communicating the truth value of these stories to your children and doing it accurately. So it's just something really interesting, I think.
Well, that's interesting. One, because it ties into my story of the week or my item of the week.
Cool.
And then two, yeah, I think probably to wrap this section up, you guys have heard Steve and I talk about preaching to your kids enough tonight. um, that yeah, when you tell your kids things, really, I mean, tell them what's true and what's not true, and don't just assume it's true.
Right.
Find out, do your research. You know, we shouldn't be blindly telling our children something that we think is true because it's something we always heard, whether it's
Right.
related to the Bible
So
or
true.
not. It could be
That's
about
fantastic.
anything. Um,
It's a great point.
again, children, you don't know at such a young age. I mean, yeah, children have personality; they're themselves at the age, but you don't know how how a child might take something the wrong way and it really affect them. So
That's
I
right.
know all of us are guilty probably every day of just saying stuff off the cuff to our kids and just realizing, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or not even realizing even that aspect of it. But just be really purposeful dealing with telling your children things that are factual or that you really want to instill in them. I think that's a good place to end that. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, for sure. Let's move on to talking about some fiction stuff like you have here.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I'm giddy about.
Yeah,
So
let's do it.
so we've already kind of covered that children are just full of wonder and excitement. And I mean, they're just great that they're happy, cranky a lot too, but they're just excited that even when you're a teenager, even adults, but even you're a teenager, all the way up through, what do you want to do? You just want to laugh. You want
Yeah.
your dad to make you laugh. You want to watch a funny show. You want to explore. You want to use your imagination. You just want to have fun. That's what it comes down to. Um,
I thought it was
but
only girls that wanted to have fun.
uh, my mistake. My
Uh,
mistake.
Sorry. That's
Don't maybe start singing, Steve. Do we start singing?
must be thinking about a different podcast. Sorry.
Yes. Um, So, kind of going back to my experience when I was 9 years old, and I did listen to the Hobbit tapes beforehand, but watching Lord of the Rings for the first time in the theaters. Now, granted, obviously, if you stick a 9-year-old kid in the theaters to watch Lord of the Rings, not everyone's going to be drawn to fantasy or fiction. I understand that, but with my with just a kid's imagination, man, I remember sitting there and finishing that movie and just totally being enthralled with the story that was presented for me and the characters. And of course, I wasn't thinking in terms of that as a kid. I was just thinking, wow, that was awesome. But
Yeah, for sure.
um I really think I think no matter what, I probably still would have gone into fiction and reading and everything, but that really just created a real passion in me for not just Lord of the Rings, but just thinking about fantastic things, making stuff up in my own mind. I remember when I was 9 years old writing fantasy stories that were awful. Of course, I mean they were
Right,
horrible,
right, right.
and thank goodness that when I showed it to my dad, he praised me because that's what kept me going. He
Yeah.
he told me a couple years ago. He said, "Man, some of the stories you gave me," he said, "were just awful." And I said, but he gave me encouragement to stick with it. Like I said, obviously not every child is going to be into that. You might have a kid who's very rigid and is going to be a mechanical engineer and likes
Yeah.
to watch documentaries on how engines work, every night. But I mean, you still have to use your imagination in that areas too. But um, fiction stories, obviously, I think we can all agree it's good and right to teach your kids about good principles in life. And if you're a Christian,
Mm,
instill in things about Christian principles. But w what tangible or specific values does fiction have in
mm,
our lives? Taking away the symbolism and, token writing and having religious themes in his work, taking that out of it, just the, um, the fantasy story of Lord of the Rings. Obviously, especially as a Christian, the Bible obviously has much greater worth than that. But why invest or should we invest so much time um developing our kids into those fantasy worlds or the fiction settings and make believe? Um
mm.
I have some of my thoughts. I don't know if you kind of want to take it from there or if you're kind of thinking still.
No, yeah, let's let you dive in. The thought that I had in writing it down to maybe return to later is Mr. Rogers, and that might actually
Okay.
have a nice little tie-in for all these things. But yeah, why
Okay.
don't you keep going with
So
at sea?
I think I'm gonna actually just thinking about this, and I was just looking up stuff about children and in fantasy, and looking up authors that wrote to children, and I found a really good Dr. Seuss quote, and he said, "Children want the same things we want: to laugh, to be challenged, to be entertained, and delighted." And you know what? Kids are so different than us, but at the same time, uh, we all want the same thing. What we want to laugh, we want to have fun. We do want a challenge in our life. We want to talk to people. We love telling stories to people, whether they be true or not. And kids are just mini adults. They're going to be an adult. They're not going to be children forever. And so I I think a real tangible example, for instance, Evie, if she doesn't like doing this, then I won't do it with her. We'll find something else to do. But something that I really am excited to at least try to do with her is they have children's Dungeons and Dragons kits that you can buy, and they go
Mm,
through like an easier story with easier rules for them. And I just think that that provides an opportunity on so many levels. One, to have just to have fun, the sheer fun of it, like what Dr. Seuss says. The kid wondering what action or adventure that I'll set up next for them, or what goblin or orc they might fight, or whatever comes up. And
yeah.
then also the challenges that present itself. I remember hearing, I forget who said this and how long ago it was and in what context, but man, getting your kids to think, asking them questions when they're young to say, Why do you think we do that?" Or "How do you think this problem should be solved?" And really
Mhm.
getting their gears turning. And so I think about Dungeons and Dragons, man, just setting up a secret dungeon and there's only a, maybe a secret way to get out, and setting up a scenario where your kids have to figure out and how to work through it and overcome it. Or maybe they're low, I don't know how familiar you are with Dungeons and Dragons, but they're low on health and they may not want to take a chance with something, so they're thinking about what spell to use to get out of this scenario. So you have the
Yeah.
fun aspect, you have the challenging aspect in using your mind. And then honestly, I'm talking more about this next week, so I won't go into it too much. But man, the bonding. Um, Obviously you can
Mm.
bond over non-fictional stories too, but I just the amount of hours that I've spent talking to my dad about some of the books that we've read together, and then my stepfather, how often we would talk about Lord of the Rings, and uh, just so many moments that I wouldn't trade for anything that really shape not just my way of thinking, but my relationship with them. Just really founded on that. And so that's kind of where I stand for that. It, and I don't think anyone is going to say, no, you should never get your kids into fiction, although there might be some, some people that might do that. But as a whole, people
Mm.
will say, well, yeah, that's good. Get your kids imaginative. It's fun. What could it hurt? But I, not just that, but I actually really see a lot of strong benefit in participating with your kid. And even if it's not Lord of the Rings or directly on the fantasy side, but imagination,
Yeah.
building a castle, exploring a magical forest or whatever. Um, I just think that is a real expression of our human nature too, of the world that we live in. So anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Gosh, it's so hard. Um, it's almost like, at least me, I still have to like fight myself not to go down the road of Christianity because that's
I know, yeah.
context I have.
Yeah.
Um, um, Not that, we should fight away from that, but it's well, it just goes back to what we talked about in like the second episode of this podcast, which was just the general point that like if like the true value at the end of the day that's in all of these stories, like it makes a lot of sense if something like the Christian worldview is true. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm a business guy, right? So I like invention and wonder and thought and like building a magical world. Like what's really cool is that fiction, it's not fiction is a this is gonna get really like bonkers for a second here, but fiction is a part of the real world, right? Right?
Absolutely.
It's
It's
like
a manifestation of what people can create that fully represents how real,
e
yeah, a well-told
exactly,
story represents
exactly.
civilization as how humans interact, human nature.
Yeah,
100%.
and there's a point, um, it's almost like, there's a bias, and that again, I'm gonna get a little nerdy here, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
One of the so Alvin Plantinga is a very well-known, philosopher, probably one of the most well-respected philosophers of the 20th century, 21st century as well. I mean, he's kinda going downhill health-wise now, but, in his
What was his
prime,
name?
Alvin Plantinga,
Alright, keep
and, very, well-respected guy on epistemology and knowledge and how we know, etcetera, and, he has one of these arguments, that he's formulated, which, I mean, there's some disagreement with, but he's formulated it, and it's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism, and I'm not gonna go all into what the argument is, but the point is that in the argument, rather than even though everybody knows that ultimately what he's talking about is the development of human life, in the argument, it's actually a step of the argument is that he says, imagine, basically essentially an alien race of beings on another world, and then describes their situation. And the reason why he's doing that is because it's so difficult for us to we're so biased oftentimes in the way we think about things that like we almost have to detach in order to see the reality of the situation, right? And so it's like, what's a super basic story? Maybe something like the tortoise and the hare. Okay, it's easy enough to say to a kid, well, if you just slow down, take your time, you'll make fewer mistakes, you'll end up winning in the long run. But that's conceptually too difficult for most children to they can barely picture beyond the mac and cheese they're gonna eat for dinner.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so, but the tortoise and the hare gives a concrete sort of manifestation of this principle that is other than themselves, that they can look out into the world and see something, even though it's a fictional story. It says something very true about the world. So whatever religion, notwithstanding, fiction is very valuable in my mind because it really does. It always teaches you something about the way the world really is, because it's part of the real world. We're still all human here, whether we're talking about orcs and Klingons or whatever. I mean, you can learn something about yourself and about the real world from works of fiction. And I just think it's so interesting how universal many of the lessons and stories and things that you learn in fiction are. And I again, that's that where I would drive that ultimate point back to, is because I think the world really is structured in a certain way. And so it's no surprise that we create stories and we create worlds that sort of evince those same kind of realities. I mentioned Mr. Rogers, and I think that's an interesting, because right, part of the difficulty here that we're talking about is this tension between helping kids see the difference between the real world and the not, and the fiction, and different fiction worlds. But Mr. Rogers, so like I actually went to mrrogers.org. And so I just want to read this little excerpt here. It says, he's talking about the neighborhood of make believe, of course. And it says, this make believe neighborhood is a place that's clearly and intentionally separate from Mr. Rogers' real neighborhood. That separation serves two purposes. On the one hand, that was Fred Rogers' way of helping young children who are typically just beginning to understand what's real and what's just make believe. So, of course, certain things would happen in the make believe world that wouldn't really happen the same kind of way in the real world. So there are those obvious differences. And then, that was, I was breaking away for a minute. Back to the quote here. On the other hand, he wanted to show children that it can help to use their imagination to play and pretend about situations and feelings in their own lives. And that's the end of that quote. The new age Mr. Rogers is, of course, Daniel Tiger and Daniel Tiger's neighborhood. And right, the same kind of thing happens there, even though the whole scenario in this case is fiction. You still sort of have the two worlds, the real world for Daniel
Right.
and the make believe world for Daniel, and you see Daniel move between these two worlds, and and he learns lessons in the make believe world that are interchangeably appropriate in the real world, and then he'll make up these little songs. Like, so one of the ones, again, it's just easy to remember. If you're feeling mad and you want to roar, just take a deep breath and count to four, right? And so it's like he learned that. I don't remember the specific context, right? But this lesson was learned in the context of this fictional environment, because that's the MO, right, of the show. But
Yeah.
then he takes that lesson into the real world and actually applies it. And then as parents, we can literally apply it too. And we did, especially when they were a little younger, my oldest two, and they were really into Daniel Tiger. It was really easy to be like, okay, they're mad. And we would legit do that. If you're feeling mad, you want to roar, take a deep breath, count to four. And then we'd count to four. And it legit, I mean, it really did help. And so, yeah, no, we absolutely should not take fiction away from children. That most certainly not. Fiction is a huge part of a child's world. Um, and I don't necessarily have a three-step tactical plan for how to show
Right.
a kid the difference between the fictional world and the real world. But I think something like what we said early on, the difference in an account versus story. So maybe just some of the language patterns that we use. Um, and again, I know I've been talking a lot, but let me just underscore one point, and then I'll have you come back in here. Um, we, have you ever heard, Alex, of deep fake technology?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So
Pretty
for
pretty cool stuff.
it's pretty freaky. So for our listeners, if you're not familiar with what that is, to right, just very easily explain it is basically you could watch a YouTube video of, I don't know, I'm just making it up, George Clooney giving an acceptance speech for a reward, or for an award that he earned. The problem is that the award isn't real. The George Clooney that you're watching isn't real, no matter how much it looks like him or sounds like him or whatever. And it's actually called deep fake technology.
Yeah.
And it's a real thing. It's a real problem. I mean, you think about if this kind of thing gets into the wrong hands, you could literally have a presidential address broadcasted
Oh yeah.
that was not from the president of the United
And
States, you know?
and with technology, it's going to be available easier and easier
Mhm.
to more and more people. And whew, man, yeah.
Yeah.
Think about
And
whew,
And Meta, like the Facebook announcement recently that I don't know if you saw, but again, being in the technology world, I'm surrounded by this stuff. And so it's like, Facebook is trying to basically their parent company is now rebranded into Meta. And what they're trying to do is create what is called basically Web 3.0. Right now we're in Web 2.0, which is the social web.
yeah,
Web 3.0 aims to take that even further. And of course, everybody's heard of virtual reality, but now it's even more real than ever. And so here's my point. The problem is that now we live in a world where it's going to be harder than ever before to tell the difference between what's real and what isn't. And I think some people just don't even see that as a problem. And I mean, if you look at, like I always say, Star Trek is prophecy. I mean, look at Star Trek, the idea of the holodeck, right? So they can go to this, there's a deck on the ship that they can go to, and they can basically turn it into whatever world and environment they want to. And they're like in some of the more recent Star Treks, this is used for some fairly explicit and nefarious sorts of encounters. In some of the Next Generation episodes back in the early 90s, it was Picard, entering into Sherlock Holmes and some of his favorite actual fictional stories as that character. And that's just a foreshadowing in the early 90s of the kind of things that people are talking about now. And so it's more important than ever to be able to teach our kids the difference between what is real and what is not, and to be able to realize for ourselves what is real and what is not. And I know I'm raising more questions than answers, but what this is we're talking about a problem that is now a skill that needs to be developed. And I don't know how to develop it. I don't know what the skill looks like. I don't know what step one, two, three is, but it's important. We need to figure it out. So,
absolutely. And I think a combination of the fun and it mixed with the critical thinking, asking your kids about the stories and how something makes sense and how it doesn't. Just for the example, you continue on with the deep fake technology. Now, if I put on Lord of the Rings on my TV screen and Evie's 10 years old and she's watching it, she's gonna know that's not real. Um,
mm,
unless I really failed her raising her up in a really weird way. She's gonna know it's not real. But like what Steve was saying, if for some reason they're showing, you know, we found this video 10 years ago of President Obama saying this, never before seen, and it's really not him. But it looks, and for all intents and purposes, it's his voice and it's his face and it's in the White House or wherever it is. And so I definitely think, I don't know where it's going to go, but in the future, we will definitely see some things with deep fake and the advancement of that technology. And I don't, obviously, there'll probably be some fun stuff they do with it, some cool stuff, but in the end, think it'll probably do more harm than good. Not to be a doomsayer or anything, but it's just what Steve was going back to Steve is, yeah, have fun with your kids, teach them those fictional stories and be invested in it. My dad and I would talk all the time, man, don't you wish that was real and talk about exploring it? But in the end of the day, we knew that it wasn't. And so grounding your kids in reality, but also encouraging them to explore those areas and just really have fun with them. I This kind of naturally leads. I I guess it's a silly topic. I honestly don't think there is a wrong or right way here. Maybe there is, but I don't think so. I think it's a matter of preference, but I still think it's worth talking about is where we have that line or yeah, where we make the line is from trying to make fiction real for our children as a matter of entertainment. It's specifically talking about just the best example out there, Santa Claus.
yeah.
Um, and and believe I grew up with Santa. I actually think Santa is a fun thing. I love Christmas time. I like seeing Santas in the malls going, ho ho ho. I love the spirit. I love the season. I love it all. So I'm not someone who thinks that Santa's of the devil or that he's evil or I'm none of that. Um,
Sure.
but it definitely is worth raising up though, as far as to what to what point should you invest your child in that story? For instance, there's obviously a big difference between your child sitting down and watching A Christmas Story and seeing an interaction with Santa Claus at the mall versus telling your child, every Christmas, hey, Santa's going to come around with these cookies, and making your kid think that Santa Claus does exist. Now, the one thing I will say before getting to it is, I think that something that is wrong. Well, let me think before I say that. I would say I just want to make sure if I'm saying something is right and something is wrong, I want to make sure I'm right. I I think I'm fairly confident saying that it is wrong to tell your kids, "Hey, you better be good because Santa's watching." I think that's a very
Mm,
deceptive thing, and I know that sometimes it
yeah,
can be done, "Oh, be good, the Santa season's coming up," but I also know that, it's an easy cop out for
yeah,
say, "Hey, Santa's coming, do you want your presents?" I think that, and I think most people would agree that's probably a wrong use of it. So, take
sure.
that out of the equation, just looking at the pure innocent and fun fact of, parents, letting their kids believe in Santa until they either discover it on themselves or they tell them. I honestly, this is because Evie's 2.5. She doesn't know Santa yet. I haven't really come to that, but probably this coming Christmas time she'll be 3.5, and that will be
Yeah,
time where she could definitely understand. And so I, I'm still on the fence about it. Just the thought process that I go through is, you know what? I grew up believing in Santa. And then I found out Santa wasn't real when I think I was 9 or 10 years old. I saw on the toy it said made in China. And I asked my dad, I said,
right,
"Dad,
right,
why does it say made in China?" And he said, "Well, Santa needs elves to help him out." And then something just clicked. And I just kind of I just kind of knew then that Santa wasn't real. And it didn't hurt
right,
me at all. Uh, looking at it from a Christian perspective, didn't hurt my faith or anything like that. It was nothing like that. But
sure.
um so I don't know. I'm still on the fence about it. On one side of things, it seems wrong. It really does seem wrong to me to tell Evie that Santa is coming tonight, and it seems like an outright lie. But at the same
Yeah,
time, it is fun, and I enjoyed it growing up. And so I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know
yeah,
what book are going to decide on, and so I'm literally just right on the fence about it because I don't think there's a right or wrong. I just don't know what's the best. I guess.
yeah.
Well,
Well,
because your kids are obviously
sure,
5 and 4, so they
sure, and you'll forgive me if I speak in a little bit of coded language because there are young ears around right
so
now.
before getting into it, I think you
Yeah,
kinda know where the Schramm household is in.
yeah, right, right.
Okay, use the code, Steve.
So I do have to I do have to be, yeah, sort of studious about that. So this is um yeah, right. So we've had this discussion. Um and well, the thing is, we haven't really settled on like a, oh yeah, this is like the specific way in which we're handling it. I actually wrote a post about this a few years ago. It was back in 2017 on my blog. Um, and I will share that link in the show notes if I remember. But it's just an article I wrote.
Mhm,
How should Christian families handle Santa Claus?
right.
And I gave what I think are some pretty helpful guidelines and ways of looking at that. I did not settle on a, because it would have been disingenuous for me to have settled on a conclusion of, "Oh, this is how you should go about this."
Mhm,
I didn't wanna dictate that for people, and so what I would really did was just try to lay out the issues and give people things to think about. And again, I know I'm speaking kind of cryptically. I'm try to be, like, as direct as I
yes.
can here, but but there is a true, um so the story of, let's see, what am I go you know what? I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna say Scott Calvin because that's the from the thing.
There you go, yes.
So or maybe SC, I don't know. So the story of Calvin, right?
Yeah.
Um, is in the traditional sense of the word, it's a legend. In the sense that there is a true historical basis for what has become a legendary retelling
Mhm.
of a story. Now, what's really interesting is in the case of Jesus, some people have tried to claim this, but we actually know we have historical data that tells us that there was not enough time for legend to have developed. So automatically there's a difference between SC and JC, right? These are two
Yeah.
right, right? These are two different kinds of stories that
Well,
you can
like what I was kinda saying earlier too, no one disbelieves Santa, and then when their adult says, "You know what? Santa is."
exactly,
It's just totally it's just 2 totally different things.
exactly, and the thing about it is that as far as historical reality and this is a huge point, I feel like right now. As far as historical reality and scholarship are concerned, JC is not legendary. SC
Hmm.
is legendary in the sense of they're both grounded in a historical reality, but only one of them is bathed and has been taken over by legend. There are still some people who would argue that certain elements of the Jesus story are legendary, but most would not be in that camp at all. And especially not with like, even the ones who are in that camp wouldn't be able to say that about many of the details of his life. They're just too historically accurate. So automatically there is a difference you could go down there. Um, one of the one of the approaches, there are some obvious approaches, right? And so like I gave some practical suggestions at the end based on the thoughts that I had um
Ca
laid out, yeah, go ahead.
can I give one suggestion? Because I only have one suggestion, and I'm just hoping
Yeah.
that maybe like a game, I'll guess mine will be on your list. And
Okay.
if it's not, then I'll bring something new to the table.
Yeah, go
So
for it. Okay.
the one thing that I heard that I actually think is a pretty good way to handle it is rather than really focusing on Santa during Christmas time, oh, Santa's coming and it's Santa, Santa, Santa over and over, more or less is as Christmas time draws near, um, you be whether it's Christmas night or probably Christmas night and your kids are excited for presents the next day, say, Saint Nick was this guy that did this, and legend has it that he still comes by and will drop a gift off for kids each
Mhm.
night, and have it
Yep.
just be a really simplistic thing. And the kid wakes up with a present from Santa and say, "Oh, look, he did come and give you something."
Yeah.
In a way that's still it, having fun with the imagination of your kids while also definitely not upplaying that Santa is a real person out there who, that's kind of a pretty good middle ground that I personally heard.
Yep. Yep. So I'm just gonna for the benefit of anyone who eventually watches, if we ever get this on YouTube, and then also you,
Oh, we will. We
so you
will
can just
see.
see. Let me show you this. And I just want to pull this up so we're both looking at the same thing. But this is the
Yeah.
article that I wrote. So definitely, so this is one of the options that I put out there, and it would be the teach JC, teach, Nick, right? And so it would be right. So teaching basically only the real historical grounding of both, right? Would be kind of that way of approaching this particular
Mm.
issue.
Yep.
Um, another option I gave was just to straight up teach both. The traditional, of both, and then one day you'll hopefully get to explain that this one's bathed in that one, like I said, SC is bathed in legend and JC is not. I do say if you choose this way, you're going to want to be absolutely certain, right, that you provide your kids
Yeah.
with a strong foundation of why you believe on Christ, who God is. You should be very intentional about that difference, and really should not mix the two in any way. And so this is where what you said about, hey, like, oh, he's watching, like he's checking to see if you've been, if you've been good or it, like that is unhelpful because it really mixes those roles in a
Absolutely.
way that is it's not true. And so I totally agree with you on that. Um, this is an interesting suggestion that I read, and this is the idea of you teach, JC, but then you also teach about becoming SC. And so it's this idea where it lessens the blow a little bit. And so as they sort of like as they get older, what you're doing is you're sort of letting them into the secret. And the secret is that, oh yeah, like it's almost like there's a kiddie version of the story, and then there's the real version of the story, which is kind of true. And in this, you can sort of become like the real person
Mhm. And
in the
and the
story.
child will kinda realize, "Oh, that's what
Yeah.
mom and dad were saying." That's interesting.
Yeah, and so what it is they sort of right, because one of the things that you can't do, and I say I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing now, but like so one of the things that you can't do, and I say can't in the sense that I mean they're your kids, you can do whatever you want. But one of the things that would be really difficult to get away with, given your kids are gonna be in Sunday school, they're gonna
Yeah,
be in
right,
middle
right.
school, like you're gonna have a hard time in our culture raising your kids to believe that
Absolutely.
C is not you know what I'm saying? Um that's just not a reality, for many, and it would be very difficult because you're gonna get all the parents coming to you like, "What the frick, man?" Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, what happened?
Like and so this is sort of a way for, like, once they are mature enough to understand and have that conversation, you can actually, it's cool because you can kinda, like, let them in, like, now they're part
I
of
guess
this
yeah.
of the secret too, and they're helping to make it fun for others, and it becomes fun for them in a different way. Now, to be completely fair, we are not in our we are not far enough even with ours to be able to have, like, made the jump
Yeah.
into that. I think it's probably coming soon, but we're not honestly even there yet. So at this point, we're still kind of straight up in JC and SC mode, and what we do is we teach them very differently. SC is only mentioned at a very specific time of year.
Mhm.
The what he brings to the table each year is very minimal. It's a very specific little like set of things, and then everything else is from who it normally would be in your in your family and such. And so it's there are ways to handle it. And I'm sorry I'm being cryptic, but there are ways to handle this and ways not to handle this. And in our family, we've chosen to handle it just in a way that undoubtedly a lot of Christians would disagree with. But I really think this is a personal matter that you have to deal with in your own family. And the
Yeah.
bottom line is, I I do not personally know of any family, and I know of one family who they
Mhm.
devastated one of their children, seriously,
Really?
because they
Yeah.
let it go on for way too long.
Mm. And
But
you
I don't
were you able to give an age there?
probably my gosh, 11, 12, 13,
Oh, yeah.
somewhere in
Yeah,
there.
yeah, no, yeah. Yep.
It was right, and so I imagine that it would be very difficult
Mhm.
for somebody to separate reality from fiction waiting that
Absolutely.
long. And, so I think right, I think this is a very much a matter of personal preference. I think that it doesn't need to go on forever. It is something that you need to decide about and sort of nip it in the bud. We haven't decided for sure if we're gonna take the whole route
Mhm.
that I just told
Yeah.
you. I think that it's a good route, but we are, right? So we are doing the option where we teach both in their traditional,
Yeah.
sense, and we're just very, very careful to not make SC into some god figure like I think some have. And
And
what I was saying, to put a cap on it, what I was saying is I am not aware personally of a family who taught in the very traditional way where there were huge issues with that person coming to later believe
yeah.
that, God wasn't real
Yeah.
or anything based on that. So it could happen, but I'm not personally aware of it.
And I'm not either, and like I said, that's why it in a way, this conversation might be a little bit silly, but I do think it's important because it's one of those topics where it does kind of bridge fiction and knowing right off the bat
Mhm.
that something is not real versus, really investing your kids in this. And if you're not a Christian, it's still a good question to ask.
Yeah, for sure.
How long do you let your kids, really believe in Santa? To what extent do you take it? So it's definitely
Yeah.
very applicable to that and anything else, and then, of course, you got the tooth fairy, good old TF over there.
Yeah. Well, I know some very passionate atheists about this issue, and they're like, "Oh yeah, well we don't do it because we don't like to lie to our kids."
Yeah,
And I'm like, "Oh, okay. Well, hello, like that. Talk about the moral high ground.
and,
I mean, honestly, I'm like,
and you can definitely see that. That's I honestly, I feel like any of these conclusions are reasonable, and that's why I don't think there's
That's
right
right.
or wrong.
Yeah, I right, exactly right. I think there are multiple ways that this issue can be legitimately handled, and I'm gonna, people are gonna disagree with me on that. Tough toodles. It's my,
Yeah,
it's the
absolutely.
way that I land on it. So
Fun story. I remember when I was a kid, had to have been 5 or 6. I was at my grandmother's house, and I had lost a tooth, and I was sleeping, and I woke up because the house was, I don't 200 or 250 years old or something. It was an old house, so, I mean,
mm,
it was rickety and, you could if a mouse walked across the floor, it sounded like the house was coming down. So,
yeah,
I woke up because I heard walking up to the bed, and I was under the sheets, and I felt my pillow lift up, and did I just say pillow? Wow, I just
you did.
pronounced it incorrectly. That's weird. I never say that. My pillow lifted up, and then it got set down, and I almost peeked, and I probably would have seen either my mom or grandmother, but I was too terrified to. So then I still believe that I could marry another 2, 3 years or so.
Wow, that's
Big story there.
crazy, crazy.
You know what? I think this has been a great discussion tonight. I don't
Yeah, I think so
even know
too.
what conclusions we came to. I just know that we tackled a lot of subjects, and hopefully it
Yeah,
was a fun discussion for everyone and something to just think about when you're playing with your kids, telling your kids about Jesus, telling them about fun, silly stories.
mm,
Just a lot. Kids are so moldable and
yeah.
just so impressionable. I just think it's something really important, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about it.
Yeah, well, this is a great thing. I think this is true. I talk about this in relation to the Bible in other contexts, but it's true about reality in general.
Yes.
Tony Robbins, one of the premier sort of motivational speakers. Do I agree with everything Tony Robbins says? No, I don't agree with everything I say half the time. So, um,
Amen.
you know what I'm saying, right? I mean, I certainly don't agree with what Alex has to say. But he does talk about these 6, essential human needs, and what's funny is that 4 of them are, like, polar opposites of each other, in the sense that, like, there's, 2 groups of 2 that are polar opposites. So, one we crave is certainty, but then we also crave uncertainty, and and so if he's right about that, and I think that he is, it's really just an interesting thing that, like, we can have an episode of a podcast like this that that we're not giving answers, we're asking more questions. And so it's like we're almost tapping into that uncertainty that most humans are have to learn to be okay with. We especially in the West, we crave certainty, and sometimes we just don't know. Sometimes we don't have the answers, and that's okay. Let's explore together. That's why it's Story World, right? We're exploring
Right.
this world of story together, and sometimes we're going to land on some concrete things, sometimes not. But I think it'll make for a great discussion like this every once in a while, where we don't really have the answers. We're just talking together and trying to figure out, what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. It's definitely been a fun journey so far,
Yeah,
and I'm looking forward to exploring the rest of it. Uh,
yeah. So story of the week. Do we jump
yes,
into that real
story
quick?
of the week. I'll go ahead first then. So it kind of falls in line to a little bit of what we were talking before. I'm late to the table when it comes to this. I know that you probably know about this podcast. I'll be surprised if you don't. But it's the um, what's it called? The Reformed
No, recovering fundamentally.
Recovering
Mhm.
Fundamentalist podcast,
Yeah.
and it's funny because I kn I grew up in a fundamentalist church, but at different times, my house was I never said was really strict, but they definitely if we heard something kinda weird at the church, we'd come home and we just knew it was silly, like, we go to the movie theaters and we would
Sure.
we behaved a normal life, and even as a kid, when I heard odd stuff preached at church that just not make sense, it just clicked for me and I knew that it was odd, so I definitely did not have it as bad as what other people do. I just kinda felt like even though I
Sure.
was involved, I was seeing everything from the outside and I kinda knew how things were, but even even with me kinda looking on the outside of that, man, this, podcast and the guys' names that run it are JC Groves, Nathan Kravitz, and Brian Edwards, and,
Yeah.
uh, I mean, it's anyone could listen to it, but especially Christians who either are still or have been, attended the fundamental Baptist church, and not saying that all of them are bad, but just the mindset of
Yeah.
the rules and to be quite honest, very like Pharisee related
Mhm.
practices of wearing this, attending these services, saying this, doing it this way. Um, Even though at the time I thought those are silly rules, that's just kind of how I looked at it. Now, really looking back at it, man, what a prohibition on. the grace gospel of Christians being able to live their life,
Yeah.
and glory for Jesus, and just all those. It wasn't just silly rules. Really coming to realize just how much that just holds people back.
Yeah. For sure.
Just an excellent podcast. I can't recommend it enough. I'm just listening to it right from the beginning to end. I have about
There you
2
go.
hours worth to catch up on. It's
Yeah.
just so phenomenal. So, yeah, I'd
Yeah.
highly recommend it. It's so good.
So I want to say something actually meaningful about this. But first, let me blow your mind a little bit because I'm not sure if you know any of this. All three of these guys are from pretty close to us, like where I grew up.
Yeah. Yep.
In Mount Airy. Yep. They're from the Mount Airy, Yadkinville, Davie County, sort of the area. Um, so Craig Edwards is Brian's dad, Brian Edwards, his dad, Craig. He actually is just retiring from the pastorate at his church in Mount Airy. When I played with the Easter Brothers, we played his church all the time. Both Craig and Brian recorded in our recording studio.
Nice.
And so, yeah, so I am on a first name basis with Craig and with Brian. And, when this podcast came out, I was like, I had mixed feelings, to be honest.
Yeah.
It because and they especially in the early episodes they took really great care to say this. I haven't listened to it for a while just because I have to be more selective now with what I
Yeah.
get to listen to.
Absolutely.
um Given the time, because I used to have a lot more time to listen to things than I have now. um there my so You and I attended the same church. We attend a independent Baptist church.
Yes.
And so it's interesting that theologically we, at least me, I can only speak for myself here. Theologically, I am very much in line with pretty much every major doctrine that I grew up learning. Like my beliefs have not changed. Um,
Yeah. I would say the same for me.
no, don't get me wrong. A little bit they have a little bit on some like super like tertiary things,
Mm.
but it's more about the difference between what is required of you as a Christian and
Yes.
what falls into your matter of Christian liberty. And so, right, so we both grew up in that background where there is a lot of rules and regulations that are sort of man-made. And don't get me wrong, like it's fine to have what one preacher calls institutional standards. You know what? When you go to work every day, guess what? You have to abide by institutional standards. I
Yep.
get that. That's a thing. But you cannot place your institutional standards in such a way that like if Jesus walked into your congregation, he would be unwelcome. And that's what happens in so many of these cases. And the reason I have mixed feelings is because, and they did take care to say this in many of their episodes, and they might still be saying it today, and caveating with it is that it, I am so thankful for the upbringing that I had. Now, unfortunately, there are churches like the one I grew up in, and I'm assuming like the one that maybe you grew up in, that are um that have been shrouded in actual abuse, not just mental abuse, but actual physical abuse, and that is shameful. It's not just our kind of church, though. It's that happens in a lot of churches, but there's definitely lots of evidence of it happening within the same sort of movement of the church that we are in. And that it's reprehensible. It's a shame. People should be rooted out, and thrown in the jail cell and locked up without a key or whatever you want to say, for that kind of thing happening. But I will say that I love my pastor. It's so funny. My my the son of my pastor who pastored the church, he took it over, the church that I grew up in just until recently. He is like now attending the church of our pastor's best friend, in
Mm.
Charlotte. Like
Yeah.
they moved anyway. And so without getting all into that, point is like I could not be more thankful for the raising and upbringing that I had, in the sense of I was taught to love the Bible.
Mm.
I was taught the difference between right or wrong. I was given opportunity after opportunity to do awesome things. I made awesome memories that I will never ever forget. That said, yeah, I'm going to disagree with some things that I grew up with because I think that they were placing unreasonable standards on the Christian in the way that they live. And so if you grew up in a context like that, it doesn't have to even necessarily be, the context of this podcast and these people is going to be that what's called the IFB
Yeah.
movement.
Right.
But it doesn't, you don't even have to have come from that background really to get something meaningful out of this podcast. I mean, these are guys who just love the Lord. I have my
Absolutely.
disagreements, just to be honest, with
Yeah.
every now and then with something that they say, or an attitude that they have in particular. I have my disagreements with. Um, for the most part, though, I applaud what they're doing.
I
I can't recommend it enough. I think it's helpful.
I do want to say this too, because I don't want to make it seem so. My pastor that I had growing up, Pastor Garnett, was a phenomenal guy and pastor, and he really fought a lot against some of the mindsets on women not being able to wear jeans and things like that.
Yeah,
I remember him getting up one time and he was sick of hearing people in the church talking about this person and that person and why they wore this and not them. Remember one day he just got up and he didn't preach on or anything. He just said, I have to say this. I don't care what you wear outside this building, inside this building. I just want you coming to church. And
right,
that
yeah.
was that. He said, I don't
You
want to hear any more about it. And so it, I definitely did. My church was not as bad as several others. It was mostly some people in the church,
yeah,
and then as
sure.
well as external speakers and pastors coming in and preaching either during revivals or other times. But I just wanted to say because I feel like I don't want to give him a disrespect. My pastor was a really great
Yeah,
man. Yeah. So
for
anyway,
sure.
I just wanted to throw that out there.
For sure, I
All
feel
right.
that, yeah, yeah,
So
so
sorry.
mine really, really quickly, I mean, mine's a super quick one, it's just I'm super excited because Star Trek Picard season 2 is coming out. I hear it is dropping on March 3rd. Now, we're recording this on, like, the 24th. I'm
Hold
not
on a
sure
second.
exactly when
Before
this
you
is
keep
coming
going, I
out.
need to get my pillow out so I can take a nap while you
Oh my
talk about.
gosh, give me a break. Oh my lord, come on, and we are not gonna be able to get along, and that's gonna be it. Um, no, so I'm excited about the new Star Trek Picard season 2 coming on. I think March 3rd. It may already be out by the time you guys are hearing this. I don't know, but I'm pumped about it. Yeah, he's giving me the Vulcan sign over there. Yep, for sure. Man, live long and prosper. Yeah, I'm excited about it. It's gonna be awesome. I'm a
Cool.
huge Star Trek fan. So
I might have to give it a shot just so you and I can talk about it.
absolutely you should. Absolutely you should. It's better than Star Wars, at least in my opinion.
You know
So
what? I have not watched enough Star Trek to give that to agree with you or disagree with you, but I can maybe see that.
interesting.
Um,
So I
I
now
have
know
gone through Star Trek.
we need some marathons on Star Trek coming
Yeah, Star Trek and a
soon.
bunch of other things. We got to get together for
Fantastic.
another
Wow,
movie
I
night.
know, I know, I know.
It's been way too long. Well, I think
Speaking of way too long, it's been a long
a
podcast.
long podcast. So
So
for all the Christians who stuck with us to the nitty gritty, you just listened to a long podcast, and for all the atheists out there who skipped to the end, you had a normal length one.
that's right.
Whether you joined us through or skipped to the end, thank you for listening. I think this was a good conversation to have, and Steve and I got plenty of more topics come up. Some serious, been a lot of fun ones. So we
For
will
sure.
definitely see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time. Thanks so much, guys.